Hey everyone, Jeremy Cubas here. Secularism is in principle not possible. From its conception in the late 13th century, the term secular referred to living in the world, not belonging to a religious order, implying belonging to the state during the medieval period. As we know, much of the Western world, much of Western Europe, had two strong authoritative powers, namely the Catholic Church and the state. These two powers dominated Western Europe, known as the Holy Roman Empire, from 962 to 1806 and formed every single social reality that we know today. From the academy to hospitals to the philosophical metaphysical assumptions on how to see the world, the state worked hand in hand with the church to develop Western culture. The clergy and the seculars were the two dominant figures for each authoritative powers. Much of the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire really was triggered by the Protestant revolt in the 1500s that began to divide the confederation of small and medium-sized political entities between the various Protestant sects and Catholics. But the serious damage that the Protestant revolt did to the Holy Roman Empire really was not merely this physical division between Protestant states and Catholic states, but rather it disrupted the axioms and beliefs that the West assumed for every aspect of philosophical, political, and academic thought and life that formed Western Europe as a whole. Although this was a long 300-some years decline, it was the spark. The Protestant revolt was the spark that lit the collapse in Europe. Europe was no longer unified in general beliefs about reality, so much so that by 1851, the British agnostic writer George Holyoake first introduced the term secularism as kind of synonymous with naturalism, meaning that one lives his life in accordance with naturalistic considerations rather than Christian ones. Or really, any kind of theology, but it was focusing on Christianity at this point. It was not necessarily atheistic in his position, for he thought atheism was too aggravating, but it was a position where a naturalistic explanation to things should be primary over anything supernatural. Now, we must remember that the term natural became intrinsically altered in the 1600s by many Protestant and really other heretical Anglo thinkers, such as John Locke, Isaac Newton, David Hume, and the like. And it changed it from the meaning, kind of a proper orientation of an object to its end, to a collective phenomenon of the physical world outside of man and man's creations, including plants, animals, landscapes, and so on and on. So this division between natural and supernatural explanations only exists by way of this new definition of the term nature, and not the traditional definition, because in the scholastic sense, in the traditional sense, in the ancient sense, all natural explanations would by necessity point towards something supernatural. For the end of all things are hierarchically prior or above, as the term supernatural really means in Latin, to the thing itself. So the nature of an object is a complete explanation of the material, formal, efficient, and final causations, and which by necessity encompasses purpose or function grounded on its metaphysical presuppositions. In other words, you cannot have a natural explanation without presupposing the act of to be itself as its first principle. However, by 1851, most of the academic and philosophical scientific world have accepted this new redefinition of the term nature. Now, it wasn't by everyone. For example, there was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, his theory is called Lamarckism, and he was a naturalist who argued that organisms can pass onto its offspring physical characteristics that the parent organism acquires through use or disuse during its lifetime. The Lamarckian theory of evolution was taking into account function and purpose, so it was a purposeful change of an organism directing its mutation and change, which differed from the Darwinian theory that is more widely accepted, that posits purposeless random mutation and change. But regardless, the new definition of nature became the stronghold, it became the assumed definition in most of the academic, philosophical, scientific, and political world. And this is really where the framework that the naturalist George Holyoake first introduced secularism. Secularism is the principle of seeking to conduct human affairs based on naturalistic considerations, uninvolved with the supernatural and religion. This really has become the default political position in the 20th century, up until now. The idea that politics can be conducted, that politics can conduct human affairs without considering religious metaphysical presuppositions, especially not the Christian ones, is how politics are attempted to be practiced today. But is this even really possible? Can we actually not have any theological or metaphysical presuppositions when conducting human affairs? Well, it seems like that's an impossibility. That of course you can't have that without metaphysics. No discussion or action or implementation about human affairs can be made without any metaphysical axioms. The secularist has a fleet, has many different metaphysical presuppositions that it's accepting as axiomatic before it can make any decisions or any even discussions on how to conduct human affairs. It holds metaphysical materialism or eliminativism as its general metaphysical system. It's nominalistic in that it reduces all human affairs as essentially material. And that's why when you see different developments of different laws or regulations, it always goes back down to material. Fundamentally, they want to make everything into a matter of economics. This is not a neutral position, but it has its own theology. It's a theological position where matter is its first principle. It's its theos, where all particular truths and conducts are derived from. All moral considerations, for example, in this framework is derived from a new sense of nature where what exists outside of human reason is fundamentally good. So if you have a deep urge, for example, to sodomize other men, this is intrinsically good because this feeling, this inclination, this urge is prior to human reason. It's a beast-like urge to behave in a certain way, so if one wants to insert their dick in another man's ass, then this urge, which is beast-like, for we see many different animals such as apes sodomizing each other and their children, should be acted upon. This urge becomes the good. So even when you have ordinary language and people talk about authenticity, what they're really referencing is some kind of deep-seated emotion that is prior to you rationalizing it. And this becomes your authentic self. And so this becomes the good. But of course, there are goods that cause harm to many people. So they implement some kind of utilitarian ethics to determine acceptable human behavior of certain urges, since certain urges are destructive, such as murder. So secularism is not devoid of a theos, it's not devoid of a metaphysics or a supernatural explanation, but rather it has its own sets of theos, metaphysicals, and presuppositions. It has its own supernatural explanations of how things function. It has its own univocal first principles, with religious adherence to them. A system without some kind of theology or without metaphysics really is just pure and utter chaos. It cannot exist. There cannot be a systematic chaos. There cannot be a system without a grounding for any kind of truth claim to be derived. It will just be random, whimsical changing assertions and considerations. Now, it may seem that way many times in this insane modern world, but that's because it is basing much of its conversation on flawed metaphysics. Not because it lacks metaphysics, but because materialism is a very weak metaphysical principle. It only takes into account, if you put it in Aristotelian terms, the material and efficient cause for the explanation of anything at all. It eliminates the formal and its final causation into the discussion. So a secular culture that is truly secular would simply be orderless and is just fantastical. It only really exists in fantasy. A true secular society cannot even exist in principle. Because to be secular means to lack a certain metaphysical and theological structure. And that just cannot happen. You cannot make an assertion. You cannot make ideas or implement laws and regulations of human behavior if you do not have a grounding for why and how things exist. If you are not positing some kind of first principle, if you're not positing some kind of theos, you cannot posit anything else either. And so what we have in contemporary secularism, as we talked in past episodes, really isn't a neutral position without theology, but rather it is the theology of the satanic worship of the self. That fundamentally truth and everything is derived from us. So secularism in general, secularism in principle really just cannot exist. All right. That's the show for today, or at least for this segment. If you want to watch the rest of the show, please subscribe in our Patreon or on our website, contragentiles.com. Thank you.